That is what it sees. A moment. And then it realizes, wait a minute, there's another moment. And then another moment. And then another moment. And all these moments are happening, or rather are moving in relation to each other so fast. One is happening right after another. As an electron moves indeterminately around the proton and the neutron, they're happening so reoccurrent and fast. When one happens and the other does not, and that does not happen and that happens does not. You see? That they form a condensation and a static conception of time. They become this environment, or rather the objects in relation to each other, forming a general substrate, we say, a slab of nature. And that thing looks real. That thing is real. That thing is where you're in. And that's the matter of it is the proton. The matter of it is the proton. And the neutron, well, those are the characters that are interplaying within it. They're neutral observers. Lies within them this indeterminate element, and the neutron being the least explainable and understandable. Even the electron, which is so uncertain and indefinite, is more definite than the neutron, which is so definite in it being unknown. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Are you just listening to a program? Because my awareness ultimately is your awareness. There is no time in that sense of awareness. We can stay out here forever. It's because that is the most primal and ultimate state of the mind, state of consciousness. Observing things happening to it. But this it that things are happening to is no thing at all. It is identical and at the same time a point in each of them and a point outside of each of them. And it is identically itself and the aspects in opposition to it. It begins off general and then it realizes everything particular, reoccurring after another. And it realizes things so particularly that it becomes one of them. It becomes just an aspect in one of them. And therefore its conception of everything becomes limited to the particular place and position it ultimately became limited to by the conception of that particular point. It became identical with. It still is ultimately all things, but it can't be ultimately all things because ultimately all things has no character. And so it must be a particular thing among particular things. Each are not all things, for all things has no character. But it does have the character of being each and every one of them, but none of them at all. And so where does this circular reasoning brings us to? What conclusion does it bring us to? It brings us to that the very concept of reason itself, that this ability to understand the world and have some conception of the world, is simultaneously the world itself. The world as it is ultimately how it is also conceived, but only in a very difficult manner that we just attempted to explain, because it is not just that easily stated. It is easier said than done. Put it that way. Because it is inherently complex and complicated. And so when we say, where does this circular reasoning brings us to, the human fallacy assumes that that is an error of thinking. That circular reasoning is, just a fallacy of logic and thought. But do you know that circular reason is actually a valid argument in logic, and that it is not invalid? It's because structurally it could still lead to true conclusions. We just don't like the soundness of it, because we say, well, you're affirming what you're trying to prove. Well, of course you have to do that in order to prove it. But then they say, well, you're taking the conclusion as the beginning. You're stating what you're supposed to arrive at the conclusion in the very introduction, at the very beginning. And so you're assuming what you're trying to prove. So, what's wrong with that? I have to assume it. How else would I propose it? I have to make the assumption. That's why it's an assumption. And therefore it's a proposition. And then that's what is being applied under scrutiny in order to be provable or proved, or rather concluded. And so we like to think of thought as a linear process. That what you begin off in the beginning ultimately is not the same at the end. That we can show between the duration, separating the beginning from the end, the line between the 2 points at the end of it, what constitutes the duration between the beginning and the end are all the reasons why the beginning is not the same as the end. And if we assume that, then we're clearly just assuming that the beginning is the same as the end. Because we just said, well, every duration has to have a beginning and an end. And therefore those two are fundamentally simultaneously present. When one is present, one cannot be without the other. And therefore, we are assuming the end also at the beginning. But then we say, well, no. Let's not do that. Let's just begin and let's just end somewhere else. Meaning that when we begin with something, it's not necessarily the case that the end is known in the same way as the beginning. And we can say, well, fair. But did you see how now you also assumed, when you assumed that there's a beginning, that it has also must come to an end? If you assume that there's a beginning but no end, now we're getting a little bit more complicated. Because then you have to say, well, there's a beginning, but then there's, after that, no end. It just keeps going forever. And that is completely contradictory in its own respect, and in fact might be logically flawed, or rather just a mere flawed when we say it is just a limited logical conclusion, an abstraction, a moment that is taken to describe the whole, a moment that on its own is assumed to describe the whole that it must only be a part of. Because if we say that there's a beginning but no end, when we, in the proposition of a beginning, we assume that a thing started somewhere, or rather the process started when at one point it was not. It is being when at one point it is non-being. And therefore, if we say that that's the case, it must have started and therefore it was at one point not started or not existing and now it exists. Well, then we assume the end of some other process, or that end of related to the beginning of itself. So you can't separate the beginning from the end, or the end from the beginning. You cannot assume a separation in the sense of an elimination of one when the other is present. One cannot be eliminated when the other is present. And therefore our thought and our logic is by nature circular. And that is the solution, that is its capacity. You see, that is the atom exhibiting that spherical form that we observe empirically, and it looks like just this mass of energy. But this mass of energy is a very generative process from where the moment comes out of. When you're looking out into an atom, the processes that we observe as an electron exhibiting these concentrated bursts of energies randomly somewhere coming from somewhere. And this density behind it that has a certain, always a certain weight, but is infinitely every kind of weight. There are every atom, every atomic structure has a different mass and density of a proton. A proton is present at every atomic structure, necessarily so. In that sense, it's abundant and infinite. And behind that, it is feeding the electronic bursts into some kind of neutral conception, a resolution that we can pick out and see as a particular event as it comes closer and closer to the field of consciousness and into the mind of the observer.